Good morning and welcome to Good Shepherd Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia for session 3 of our course on the history of the church in England. In our last session, we covered in very broad terms 1,000 years of the church in England. We started with 3 dates, 63 AD, which was when the early church came to Glastonbury in Roman Britain with Joseph of Arimathea. After the Romans withdrew in 410, the church was driven west by the Anglo-Saxon invaders. It was surviving as the Celtic or the British church in the far west, in Devon and Cornwall and Wales and Ireland. And then we looked at 563, and that was when the Celtic church, through St. Columba, extended its mission to the island of Iona in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland, and from there to Northumberland in northern England, and from there back to Western Europe. This is all before the Roman Church arrived at Canterbury with St. Augustine in 597. Later in the 800s, the Vikings almost conquered all of the Anglo-Saxon England except for Wessex, but the church survived and grew with both its Celtic and its Roman Catholic traditions, and eventually converted the Vikings to Christianity. And then we skipped ahead to 1066 with the Norman invasion, which brought mainstream European culture to Anglo-Saxon England. And William the Conqueror picked Lanfranc to be his Archbishop of Canterbury to reform the Anglo-Saxon church. But both of them maintained their independence from Rome. So that was what we covered in our last session. And this morning, I want to take a step back and talk about the theme for this course, the essential role of our Christian faith in shaping Western culture. So let's take a few minutes to summarize the gradual transformation of the ancient Roman world to the medieval world of Western Europe that way back then they called Christendom. The Middle Ages basically stretched from the end of the Roman Empire to the beginning of the modern world, about 1450. And the first point I want to make is that our civilization in the West, which developed over the 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, is based on 4 sets of ideals. Number 1 was Jerusalem. Monotheism, the idea of one God, the God of Abraham, and the Jewish tradition of the Old Testament. Number 2, Athens. Beginning in the 5th century BC, the birth of freedom and democracy in the Athens of Pericles, as well as philosophy, the concept of what is good and the role of reason in guiding our thinking. And 3, Rome. If the Greeks and the Greeks of Athens were philosophers and architects, then the Romans were lawgivers and engineers. Their genius was in the governmental organization and the administration of their empire, based on laws, military strength, and to a huge extent on really good roads. So from Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome, we have inherited one God, reason, and the rule of law, and the ideals of freedom and democracy grew out of that mix. But there was one more set of ideals that was essential for the transformation of the ancient world centered around Rome, and that was the gospel of Jesus Christ, as spread across the Roman world by the very early church. That is typically, over the years, an essential part of the study of Western civilization. And to give you an idea of how that was treated in college textbooks in Western civilization, up front, I'm going to refer to a 1964 basic text on Western civilization and share with you what college students in an earlier generation were expected to learn. This is Western Civilization to 1600 by J. Kelly Sowers, Wichita State University. The Roman world was dotted with Christian communities as the cult of Christ grew, yet its growth was accompanied by great popular hostility. The fierce spiritualism of Christians, their uncompromising monotheism, their disdain of civic or patriotic service, their cult exclusiveness, and their pride of godliness all made them suspect and hated by most of the pagan world. This popular attitude was the basis of the persecution of the Christians under Nero. During the increasing troubles at the close of the 2nd century, persecution became more general and more persistent. The disasters, plagues, wars, invasion, and sedition that rocked the state seemed to speak of supernatural displeasure. Men found the source of it in the impiety and the atheism of the Christians. Even the philosophic Marcus Aurelius countenanced a severe persecution, and Septimus Severus made conversion to Christianity a serious crime. During the military crisis of the 3rd century, the Emperor Decius instituted the first widespread and systematic persecution, but still the Christians grew in number. In the totalitarian state constructed by Diocletian, the Christians were a conspicuous, non-conforming minority standing apart from the majority of loyal citizens. They constituted a state within a state. It was becoming apparent, even to the most implacable of Christianity's enemies, that persecution had failed to destroy the cult. While many Christians renounced their faith in the face of threats and torture, the great majority of them remained firm. Moreover, their fortitude attracted large numbers of converts, and perhaps even more important, had roused the grudging admiration of still larger numbers of pagans. As Christianity grew, the hostility to it turned to acceptance. The blood of the martyrs was indeed the seed of the church. In 311, Galerius, the most savage enemy of the Christians among the contending emperors, admitted that the persecutions were a failure, and he extended tolerance to the Christians in the form of legal recognition and restoration of property. And that was the basis of Constantine's famous Edict of Milan in 313. The Edict of Milan was, at least for Constantine, more than simply a recognition that Christianity had become too strong to be destroyed. It represented an entente between the emperor and the Christian church. The Christians were a significant minority in the empire, perhaps 10% of the people. But more important than their numbers was their spirit. They had generally abandoned their hope of the millennium and accepted the social obligations of this world. Their concepts of charity and brotherhood made them a stable and healthy force in society. Their certainty of salvation and their general decency gave them a vigor that contrasted sharply with the hopeless lethargy characteristic of the dying paganism. Furthermore, Christianity attracted to its ranks men of great ability and capacity for leadership. In the permissive climate of toleration, Christianity became, before the end of Constantine's reign, the preeminent religion of the empire. The Roman state had accepted the spiritual state within its border. Though Christianity owed its victory partially to extraneous circumstances, the chief reasons for its triumph were inherent in the Christian faith itself. It was simple, direct, and appealing. The apostles and other early missionaries preached successfully to the simple, the ignorant, and the hopeless, for they were themselves simple fishermen and laborers and artisans. But they were imbued with the hope so strong that it could transform those who received it. They spoke in the rough dialects of the common people. Christianity, like Judaism, was uncompromising in its insistence upon monotheism, and this set it clearly apart from the mystery religions and from paganism generally. Most of the hostility, both official and unofficial, towards Christianity during the first 2 centuries seems to have stemmed from their refusal to worship any god but their own. From the firmness of Christian conviction flowed an ethical vigor that was one of its most telling advertisements. Much of this was an inheritance from Judaic morality. Some of it was simply the Christian expression of generalized Stoic morality. But the prime and the peculiar source of the moral decency of Christianity lay within Christ's teaching. For he spoke most often not of supernatural things, but of behavior. The Sermon on the Mount is typical. This emphasis carried over to the apostles. Paul expressed it in the famous passage in his first letter to the Corinthians. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. In the study of Western civilization of a couple of generations ago, this is the emphasis on how Christianity transformed the ancient world. And it's a history that we cannot forget. The moral decency, in Soward's words, found within the teachings of Jesus, was the key ingredient that the new faith of Christianity would add to the inheritance of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome to build the foundation of Western culture. And in this process, Christianity transformed the values of the ancient world. At one time, this was also an essential part of the study of ancient and medieval history in our high schools. Let's take a look at a high school textbook from a century ago. Ancient and Medieval History, 1929. Carlton Hayes and Parker Moon were professors of history and international relations, respectively, at Columbia University. And I can find no better explanation of how Christianity transformed the values of the ancient world. Part 5, the transition from classical to Christian civilization. Chapter 13, Christianity in the Roman Empire. And the authors talk about how Christianity became the state religion and conclude that there was a big price which Christianity paid for becoming a state religion. The church, as it grew and prospered and came into close relationship with the state, elaborated its ritual and its organization. Magnificent church buildings were erected, and ceremonies of public worship assumed a complexity and a grandeur befitting the majesty of the Roman Empire. So the church did pay a price for becoming the state religion in the Roman Empire. But the authors go on to explain how the new religion of Christianity transformed the values of the ancient world. Influence of Christianity. The triumph of Christianity within the Roman Empire meant that Christian customs and usages became dominant in the Roman Empire. Sundays and special feast days of the Christian church were thenceforth regularly observed as imperial holidays. Christian ceremonies were associated with such familiar experiences as marriage, birth, and death. And not only were outward observances changed, but the interior life of individuals and of the state was gradually transformed. On the family, there can be little doubt that Christianity inculcated higher standards of moral conduct in the masses of its disciples than did paganism, and that it performed a great service in purifying and uplifting society. Christianity put special emphasis on the home and the family as the very center of religious and moral life. It placed new responsibilities upon the father of a family. It stressed the duty of parents to children and of children to parents. It signally raised the position of women and made marriage a sacrament and insisted upon purity of life. On slavery, another great social change which Christianity wrought affected the working people and the slaves. Hitherto, those who had toiled with their hands had been looked down upon and despised as inferiors. Many of them were outright slaves, and slavery was the basis of Greek and Roman economic life. Christianity, however, taught that rich and poor are equal in the sight of God. All have immortal souls, and the poor man may be a better Christian than the rich man. Slavery was not abolished throughout the Roman Empire, all at one time or by one act, but the church encouraged the emancipation of slaves and protected the freedman. On labor, at the same time, the church, by pointing out that Jesus had worked with his hands as a carpenter, and by teaching that manual labor is not a disgrace, but a wholesome and honorable way of earning a livelihood, That did much to establish the dignity of labor. It was a timely lesson in good economics. Christianity held up new and much needed ideals of honest work and of simplicity, frugality, and temperance in living. On cruelty and vice, still another way in which the influence of Christianity was shown was in the campaign waged by the early Christians more and more successfully against the vice and cruelty that characterized the Roman Empire, as long as it was pagan. Christianity introduced greater humanity and humaneness into public and private life. It interested itself, as paganism had never done, in all manner of charitable undertakings, in the moral and physical well-being of prisoners, in the establishment and support of hospitals, in the care of the poor, the sick, the widows and orphans, the lame, the halt, and the blind. It stopped the selling of children, and it forbade all traffic for immoral purposes. It denounced, too, the Roman gladiatorial combats. Now, to be sure, cruelty and vice were never abolished, but under Christianity, they were diminished and their opposites were held up as ideals of individual and social behavior. And Christianity also produced new types and forms of art and literature. You get the idea. High school students a century ago were taught Western civilization and ancient and medieval history and learned the ways in which Christianity transformed the values of the ancient world. And again, that's an important lesson of history that we must not forget. So there you have it. In order to understand the foundation of our Western civilization, we need to look at the heritage of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome as transformed by the Christian church. The conclusion that I draw is that Western culture is worthy of our study because it is in the West that we can trace the rise of human freedom and human potential most clearly. And underlying that unique culture is the faith and tradition of the Christian church and its embrace of reason. And that faith tradition understands that man is created in the image of God. It was the church that developed over 1,000 years the advanced civilization based on reason and literacy that emerged very, very, very gradually from the chaos and the barbarism that followed the fall of the Roman Empire. So, let's take a broad look at the Roman Empire and what happened in its aftermath. In the 1st century BC, Rome was transitioning from a republic into an empire. Following a century of civil war, Rome experienced a revolution which ended the republic and led to the creation of a military dictatorship under Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor. Now, Rome kept all of the visible institutions of the old republic, including the Roman Senate, but the real power was concentrated in the emperor, and he was worshipped as a god, combining a pagan church with the state. Now, this military dictatorship actually proved to be more effective in administering a far-flung empire, and by the time of Jesus' birth, the Roman Empire stretched from Gaul and Spain in Western Europe all the way around the Mediterranean Sea to the east, with Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Greece, and Turkey. And the Romans were really expert at public administration. Within this empire, there would be more than 3 centuries of relative peace and prosperity, the Pax Romana, from the time that Jesus lived until well into the 300s, the 4th century. This was in large part thanks to the strength of the Roman army and its ability to defend the perimeters of the empire and guarantee the privileges of Roman citizenship, together with an excellent network of Roman roads that the engineers designed and built, and the evidence of which we can still see today across Europe. This era provided very fertile ground indeed for the growth of the early Christian church. Missionaries followed these Roman roads all across the empire, spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then, in 55 and 54 BC, Julius Caesar, after he conquered Gaul, crossed the Channel into Britain. And as they say, he came, he saw, but he did not conquer. Now the Celts had settled in this island that the Romans would call Britannia, starting around 600 BC. And the name Celts comes from the Greek word keltoi, which means strangers. They came from the area between the headwaters of the Rhine, the Rhone, and the Danube rivers, and they spread across Europe. Their priests and their magistrates were called Druids. The Cantiaci were the Celtic tribe in what today we call Canterbury in Kent. The Belgi were tribes of mixed Celtic and Germanic stock from Gallia Belgica, which we call Belgium today, and they came over and conquered Britain in 75 BC. Now these were really fierce warriors, and they convinced Julius Caesar, who had conquered Gaul and who was no slouch at slaughtering his enemies, to basically turn around in 54 BC and take his legions back across the Channel to Gaul. And the Romans didn't come back again for almost another century, until 43 AD, when the Emperor Claudius sent another Roman army to invade and subdue those wild Britons. And that begins the Roman occupation of Britannia. It took another 20 years to crush the resistance in southern Britannia, and the conquest was completed by the year 85. Now, in the meantime, we recall Joseph of Arimathea had planted the church in Glastonbury. Britannia was the furthest, the westernmost province of the entire Roman Empire. And compared to the advanced civilization of Rome, it was really a barbarian wilderness. And the Romans never made it to the western counties of Devon and Cornwall. They never made it to Wales or to Ireland. But south of Hadrian's Wall, they built an advanced civilization. They had well-planned towns and country estates. They had indoor plumbing. And it was another 1,000 years after the Romans left before even the kings of England had indoor plumbing. The Romano-Britons prospered under the protection of the Roman legions who guarded the frontier. The Romans attempted, but they were never successful, to conquer the fierce tribes to the north of Hadrian's Wall, the area that the Romans called Caledonia. One of those Celtic tribes was called the Picts by the Romans because they were the painted people. Now, we don't know too much about the early church in Britain, but we do know the story of St. Alban, the first Christian martyr in Britain in 305. And apparently St. Alban was a Romano-Briton, and he was very sympathetic to the Christian church in Britain. A priest came and hid in his home, and he was under suspicion by the Roman army. The Roman soldiers came to Alban's home looking for this priest who was hiding in Alban's home. And when they knocked on the door and they asked for the priest, Alban said, "I am that priest." And so the Romans took Alban away and he was executed. Alban became St. Alban, the very first martyr, at least the first recorded martyr for the church in Britain. And so the British, or the Celtic church, survived and thrived in the Roman province of Britannia on the very far western edge of the empire up through the beginning of the 5th century, the early 400s. And then the empire began to fall apart. And so what happened? And that's a question that has challenged historians for many, many centuries. And we'll take up that question in our next session. Thank you.